A few weeks ago, I was sitting at my kitchen table with my tax returns spread out in front of me. 3 different 1099 forms, a brokerage statement, capital gains schedules from 2 accounts I'd completely forgotten I rebalanced last year. My wife walked past, glanced at the pile, and said, "You look stressed. Is something wrong?" I told her I wasn't stressed exactly. I was annoyed. My taxes used to take 20 minutes with a single W-2. This year, I was looking at 4 hours of work, 3 forms I didn't recognize, and a federal bill that was a couple $1,000s higher than the year before, almost entirely from gains I'd realized when I rebalanced. She looked at me for a second, then said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She said, "Tom, you do realize what that pile actually means, right?" She was right. The pile meant I'd been getting rich for years without noticing. Every annoying form on that table was a small piece of evidence. Investment income that wasn't there a decade ago. Dividend statements I'd never seen before. Capital gains from accounts I'd half forgotten about. All of it had quietly built up while I was busy worrying about whether we were really making progress. The complaint was the proof. That moment is what I want to talk about today. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. The reason I'm doing this video is that I get a version of the same question every week in the comments. Someone in their 40s or 50s writes in and says, "I've been doing all the right things. I save into my 401k, I bought a house, and I pay off my credit cards every month. But I don't feel rich. Am I actually making progress, or am I fooling myself?" The honest answer to that question almost never lives in the bank balance. The bank balance is a lagging indicator. By the time the number on your screen reflects wealth, the wealth itself has been quietly building for years. The leading indicators show up earlier, and they live in your daily life, not on the screen. The 8 signs in this video are the ones I noticed in my own life, and in the lives of the people I know who are quietly doing well. None of them feel important when they're happening. All of them mean something. Sign 1. You can describe your 75-year-old Tuesday in actual detail. There's a question I started asking people in their 40s and 50s a few years ago. The question is, describe what your 75-year-old self does on a Tuesday afternoon. Specific. The answer most people give is something vague like, "I travel more," or "I retire well." I'm asking for the actual Tuesday at 2 o'clock. What does the room look like? What's on the table? What are you doing? Most people freeze. They've never actually pictured it. The future is an idea, not a place. That's the giveaway. If you can't picture the day, you haven't internalized that the day is coming, and you almost certainly aren't routing money toward making it real. The people who are secretly getting rich answer this question instantly and in vivid detail. My retired neighbor Paul, who some of you have heard me talk about before, can tell you exactly what his Tuesdays look like. He walks the dog at 7 a.m. for about 40 minutes, eats breakfast while reading the paper for an hour, works on a woodworking project in his garage from 10 to noon, has lunch with his wife, takes a nap, then reads a novel until 4. He described all of this to me 5 years before he actually started living it. Paul needs about $52,000 a year to fund that Tuesday. At a 4% withdrawal rate, that's $1.3 million invested, which he has. The Tuesday existed in his head long before the portfolio caught up with it. That's not coincidence. That's how it gets built. The vividness of the picture is the sign. When you can describe the room, the smell of the coffee, the book on the side table, you've been quietly transferring the future into the present long enough that the math has been chasing the picture instead of the other way around. Most people try to retire on a number. The people who actually pull it off retire toward a picture, and the number gets built underneath it without conscious effort. Sign 2. A $3,000 surprise gets absorbed without you noticing. Last month, my neighbor Greg's water heater died on a Saturday morning. The plumber came out, gave him a quote of $3,200 for a new unit installed. Greg told me about it that afternoon over the fence. The way he said it told me everything. He said, "Yeah, it's annoying. Already paid. Hopefully the new one lasts 15 years. Notice what's missing from that sentence. There's no anxiety about which credit card had room, no question about whether they'd push back a vacation, no scrambling to rearrange the month's budget. The $3,200 came out of an account. The account had room. The account refilled itself on autopay over the next 2 months. The household budget didn't even register what had happened. The water heater stopped being a crisis the moment the buffer underneath it was big enough to absorb the cost without anybody having to do anything." Per Bankrate's 2025 Emergency Savings Report, 59% of Americans couldn't cover a $1,000 unexpected expense with savings, let alone a $3,000 one. The median emergency fund balance in America, per Empower's June 2025 survey, is roughly $500. Half of households have less than $500 between them and the next surprise. When Greg called his water heater annoying, he was unconsciously announcing he'd crossed a threshold the majority of his neighbors haven't. The signal isn't that the bill got paid. The signal is that the household around the bill didn't have to do anything. No conversation, no spreadsheet, no week of stress. A real money expense washed past you and didn't change your week. That's structural wealth doing its job in the place wealth does most of its work, which is the place you can't see. Sign 3. Your tax return got harder for the right reasons. This is the one that opened the whole video. Tax returns get harder over time for one of 2 reasons. The first is that your life has gotten more complicated through side gigs, freelance income, or financial mess you're trying to clean up. The second is that your investment income has finally grown enough to start mattering on the return. Those are 2 very different stories. The way you can tell which one you're in is the forms. If you're seeing 1099 divs for dividends, 1099Bs for sales inside taxable accounts, capital gain schedules, year-end statements from brokerages you've half forgotten about, your tax return is reflecting wealth, not chaos. The IRS treats those forms as work for you. Your accountant treats them as billable hours. But the actual signal underneath is that capital has started earning income at a rate the government finds interesting. That's the entire definition of secret wealth building. I want to put a number on this so it isn't abstract. The S&P 500 closed 2025 with a total return of about 17.9%, including dividends, the 3rd straight year of double-digit gains. At current S&P 500 dividend yields of roughly 1.1%, someone holding $350,000 in a broad taxable index fund would have generated around $4,000 in qualified dividends inside a single tax year. That number gets reported on a 1099 div. The first time that form shows up in meaningful size in your mailbox, you've crossed a threshold. The form is the wealth introducing itself. If your tax return has been getting incrementally more annoying every year for reasons that aren't a side hustle or a small business, take it as a quiet trophy. The reason your return takes 4 hours instead of 20 minutes is that there's now something there worth taxing. There wasn't before. Sign 4. You started repairing things because shopping for a replacement is the bigger cost. I want to draw a distinction here that matters. There's a common kind of personal finance content that says rich people repair and broke people replace. That's not quite right. Plenty of broke people repair because they have no choice. The sign isn't the repair. The sign is the reason. Here's what I mean. Last spring, my dryer started making a clicking sound. I looked online and the part to fix it was $62 plus an hour of my time watching a YouTube video. I could have easily replaced the dryer. We had the money. The new one would have been faster, slightly more efficient, possibly smarter. The reason I fixed it instead had nothing to do with the $62. The reason was that buying a new dryer is a project. You research it, compare models, schedule delivery, deal with haul away of the old one. Probably 4 hours of decision work to save 15 minutes per laundry cycle. Plus 6 months of mild buyer's regret about which model you should have picked. That math used to flip for me. In my 30s, I would have replaced the dryer because the new thing felt like progress. In my 40s, the new dryer feels like 4 hours of homework I don't want to do. The cost of the decision became bigger to me than the cost of the device. That's a sign your financial life has gotten quiet enough that you protect your attention more carefully than your wallet. The same pattern shows up in cars. The average new car transaction price in America crossed $50,000 for the first time in late 2025, an all-time high per Kelley Blue Book. The average new car loan now runs nearly 6 years per Experian's Q4 2025 data. The math case for keeping a paid-off car has never been stronger. But the bigger reason most secretly wealthy people keep their old cars isn't really the math. It's that car shopping is exhausting and they have better things to do. If you've started solving problems with repairs because the alternative is shopping, you're further along than you think. Sign 5. You picked up the check at family dinner without running the math first. My brother-in-law Kevin works in HVAC. Solid trade, decent income, 3 kids in school. He's not wealthy, but he's not broke either. Last Thanksgiving, the whole extended family went out to dinner at a place that ended up costing about $340 for the table after tax and tip. When the check came, 2 things happened at once. My mother-in-law started reaching for her purse, and Kevin started doing visible math on the back of a napkin. I just took the check, handed the server my card. The whole thing took maybe 4 seconds. Kevin watched it happen and said, "You didn't even look at the number." I told him I didn't need to. The buffer in our checking account makes a $340 dinner a non-event. We could pick up that check 3 times a week for a year before it dented anything that mattered. That sounds smug when I say it out loud. It didn't feel smug. It felt like the absence of friction. The first time you pick up the check for the family without running the math, without negotiating with yourself, without worrying about whether you'll be able to make up for it later in the week, something has shifted underneath you that you didn't engineer in that moment. You engineered it years earlier by saving consistently into a system that built a buffer thick enough to make small generosities feel weightless. The check isn't the wealth. The smoothness of paying it is. Kevin asked me on the drive home how I'd built that. I told him the truth. I told him that for 15 years, I'd quietly been routing 25% of my paycheck into investments before I ever saw the money, and that the dinner I'd just paid for was, in a real sense, paid by a 32-year-old version of me who never met the 47-year-old standing at the table. Sign 6. Your spouse stopped asking what things cost. This one is delicate, because I don't want it to sound like financial secrecy is a good thing. It isn't. Healthy couples talk about money. What I'm describing is something different. There's a phase in a relationship when one partner asks about every meaningful purchase the other one makes. Not because of control, but because the household actually needs the information to function. How much was that? Gets asked because the answer affects whether the lights stay on. There's a later phase when that question quietly stops being necessary. Both partners know roughly what the other spends. Both partners trust the system that's been running for years, and the household has a deep enough buffer that individual purchases don't need real-time conferencing. My wife and I crossed into that phase about 7 years ago, and it took me 3 years to even notice it had happened. The mechanism is automation plus history. We have automatic transfers that move 25% of our combined take-home into investments before either of us touches the money. The remaining 75% lives in a checking account we both can see in the same banking app. Neither of us has to police the other because the system polices itself. If something is in the checking account, it can be spent. If it isn't, it can't. The system replaced the conversation. I'm not saying don't talk to your spouse about money. I'm saying notice the conversations you've stopped needing to have. The price tag check-ins, did you see the credit card statement text on a Wednesday afternoon? The explanations that used to come up reflexively. When those start fading without anyone deciding to stop, it isn't because you've grown apart. It's because the structure underneath the relationship has gotten strong enough to carry the weight that the conversation used to carry. That structural sturdiness is wealth doing its work, in a place wealth doesn't usually get credit for. Sign 7. You slept through a stock market crash. Between February and early April of 2025, the S&P 500 dropped almost 19% from its peak, briefly slipping below 5,000 for the first time since April 2024, and just barely avoiding bear market territory. If you were paying close attention in that stretch, the decline was on the front page of every financial publication. People were sending me panicked screenshots. I had 3 different friends ask me whether they should get out for a while. I didn't do anything. I genuinely don't think I checked my brokerage account once during that period. My automatic contributions kept moving on the 1st and 15th of every month, buying more shares at the lower prices. And by the time I looked at my account again in the summer, the decline had become a faint memory. The S&P finished 2025 up roughly 17.9% on a total return basis. I slept fine the whole way through. That non-reaction is one of the most underrated wealth signs there is. Per Dalbar's most recent quantitative analysis of investor behavior, the gap between the average actual equity investor's return and the S&P 500 index has been about 1.2 percentage points per year over the last 20 years. That percentage sounds small. The dollars aren't. On $100,000 invested for 20 years, a 1.2% annual drag costs you roughly $100,000 in foregone returns. The percentage is a paper cut. The cumulative bill is a whole second portfolio. The people who don't panic sell aren't braver than everyone else. They've just built distance between themselves and the daily price. The distance is the sign. The first time a 15% or 20% drop washes past you without producing an emotional reaction or a phone call to your brokerage, you've quietly become the kind of investor who outperforms the average investor by simply not interfering. That's almost the entire skill. The math does the rest. Sign 8. Your closet, garage, and cabinets stopped expanding. This is the one I noticed last, and it took my wife to point it out. About a year ago, she mentioned, almost in passing, that she couldn't remember the last time we'd bought a piece of furniture, a new appliance, or anything substantial that wasn't a direct replacement for something that broke. The house had been steady for years, and the closet and the garage had quietly stayed that way too. Things came in only when something else left. This sounds like minimalism, but it isn't. We weren't trying to own less. We just stopped reaching for new stuff because the reaching itself had quietly stopped feeling rewarding. That's a different mechanism. Minimalism is a decision. What I'm describing is the disappearance of the decision. My neighbor David, who's Chinese American and grew up in Fujian before moving to the States, has lived in the same house for 19 years. The furniture in his living room hasn't changed in the entire time I've known him. He told me once that his grandmother had a saying about wealth that translates roughly as, "The thing you stop wanting is worth more than the thing you buy." I think about that line a lot. The wanting itself is the cost. Wanting drives buying. Buying drives more wanting. And the cycle taxes both your money and your attention. When the wanting stops, the spending naturally falls along with it, freeing up your attention and letting the money compound without anything else having to change. If your house, your closet, your storage spaces have all quietly stopped expanding, and you didn't make a decision for that to happen, you're watching the wanting machine wind down on its own. That's wealth getting silent. The quietness is the sign. So those are the 8 signs we just walked through. They share a common thread, which is that none of them feel like wealth in the moment. Describing your retirement Tuesday out loud sounds like daydreaming, not like progress. Your spouse not asking about prices anymore just feels like routine. Sleeping through a market crash registers as luck rather than discipline, and the annoying tax return looks like a chore instead of a trophy. Each sign appears as the absence of something that used to be there, not the presence of something new. That's the trick. Wealth, the real kind, mostly shows up as the absence of friction in places where friction used to live. Here's the part I actually want to land. None of these signs mean you've already arrived. They mean the math is doing its job, even when the feeling hasn't caught up. The bank balance comes last. The feeling that you've made it comes even later. And for some people, honestly, never. What you can do between now and the day the bank balance confirms what the signs have been quietly saying is trust the signs. Per the Federal Reserve's most recent survey of consumer finances, the median household net worth for Americans 45 to 54 is about $247,000. For ages 55 to 64, it's about $364,000. If you're above those numbers and you still feel like you're not making progress, the problem isn't the math. The problem is the feeling. And the signs above are the early warning that the math is way ahead of the feeling. What you can trust is the math itself, the new silence around money in your daily life, and the absence of crises that used to feel like crises. I get a comment every week from someone who watched a video on this channel a year ago, started routing 15 or 20% of their income to investments automatically, and writes in to say they don't feel any different, but the numbers are bigger than they expected. That's exactly how it's supposed to feel. The math runs ahead, the feeling catches up later. Some of the signs in this video are probably already true in your life. You just didn't know to look for them. Drop a comment with which sign hit you the hardest, even if you only have one of the 8 so far. I read every comment, and I'll reply to as many as I can. And if you want me to walk through the exact automation rules that build the buffer behind sign 2, the system that turns a $3,000 surprise into background noise, hit subscribe, because that's the next video. I'll see you in the next one.